20. Nahri. It's a lock. A lock? No, it cannot be. Look at it. It's obviously some advanced mechanism. A scientific tool. Or, considering the fish, perhaps a navigational aid for the sea. It's a lock. Nahri took the metal object from Alizade's hands. It was made of iron and shaped like an ornate fish with fluttering fins and a curved tail, and it had a series of boxy pictograms carved into one side. She pulled free a pin from her headscarf and turned the lock over to find the keyhole. Holding it close to her ear, she expertly picked it, and the bar swung open. See? A lock. It's just missing its key. Nahri triumphantly handed the ornamental lock back to Ali and leaned into her cushion, propping her feet up on a plump silk ottoman. She and her overqualified tutor were in one of the upper balconies of the Royal Library, the same place they'd been meeting every afternoon for the past few weeks. She took a sip of tea, admiring the intricate glasswork of the nearby window. The impressive library had quickly become her favorite place in the palace. Even bigger than Ghassan's throne room, the huge roofed-over courtyard was filled with bustling scholars and arguing students. On the balcony across from them, a Sahrain instructor had conjured up smoke into an even larger map than the one Dara had made for her during their desert crossing. A miniature boat of spun glass floated in its sea. The instructor raised his hands, and a gust of wind filled its silken sails, sending it racing along a chart marked by tiny burning embers as several students watched. In the alcove above him, an Agnivanshi scholar was teaching mathematics. With each snap of her fingers, a new number appeared scorched on the whitewashed wall before her, a veritable map of equations her pupils were diligently copying. And then there were the books themselves. The shelves soared out of sight to meet the dizzyingly high ceiling. Ali, who seemed utterly delighted by her interest in the library, had told her that its vast inventory contained copies of just about every work ever written, both human and jinn. Apparently, there was an entire class of jinn who spent their lives traveling from human library to human library, meticulously copying its works and sending them back to be archived in Daevabad. The shelves were also crowded with glittering tools and instruments, murky preservation jars, and dusty artifacts. Ali warned her away from the majority. Apparently, small explosions were not uncommon. The jinn had a propensity for exploring the properties of fire in every form. A lock. Ali's words pulled her attention back. The prince sounded disappointed. Two library attendants flew through the air behind him on carpets the size of prayer rugs, retrieving books for the scholars below. Efel, she corrected his Arabic, not Kefel. He frowned, pulling over a piece of parchment from the stack they'd been using to practice letters. But it is written like this. He wrote out the word and pointed to its first letter. Kaf, no? Nahri shrugged. My people say Ethel. Ethel, he repeated carefully. Ethel. There, now you sound like a proper Egyptian. She smiled at Ali's serious expression as he turned the lock over in his hands. The jinn don't use locks? Not really. We find curses to be a better deterrent. Nahri made a face. That sounds unpleasant, but effective, after all. He met her gaze, a slight challenge in his gray eyes. A former maidservant just picked one rather easily. Nahri cursed herself for the slip. I had a lot of cupboards to open, cleaning supplies and such. Ali laughed, a warm sound she rarely heard that always took her a bit by surprise. Are brooms so valuable among humans? She shrugged. My mistress was stingy. He smiled, peering into the lock's exposed keyhole. I think I should learn to do this. Pick a lock? She laughed. Are you planning a future as a criminal in the human world? I like to keep my options open. Nahri snorted. Then you'll need to work on your accent. Your Arabic sounds like something spoken by scholars in the ancient courts of Baghdad. He took the jab in stride, returning it with a compliment. I suppose I'm not making as much progress as you in our respective studies, he confessed. Your writing has truly come a long way. You should start thinking about what language you'd like to tackle next. Devasti. There was no question. Then I can read the Nahid texts myself instead of listening to Nasreen drone on. Ali's face fell. I fear you'll need another tutor for that. I barely speak it. Truly? When he nodded, she narrowed her eyes. You told me once that you know 5 different languages, and yet you couldn't find time to learn that of Daevabad's original people? The prince winced. When you put it that way. What about your father? He's fluent, Ali replied. My father is very taken with Deva culture. Muntadir as well. Interesting. Nahri filed that information away. Well, that settles it. You'll join me when I start. There's no reason for you not to learn. I look forward to being outmatched, Ali said. Just then, a servant approached, bearing a large covered platter, and the prince's face lit up. Salams, brother. Thank you. He smiled at Nahri. I have a surprise for you. She raised her eyebrows. More human artifacts to identify? Not exactly. The servant pulled away the top of the platter, and the rich smell of sizzling sugar and buttery dough wafted past her. Several triangles of flaky, sweet bread sprinkled with raisins, coconut, and sugar were stacked on a plate. The aroma and sight immediately familiar. "Is that fatir?" she asked, her stomach immediately grumbling at the delicious scent. "How did you get this?" Ali looked delighted. "I heard there was a Shafit man from Cairo working in the kitchen and requested that he prepare a treat from your home. He made this as well." He nodded at a chilled carafe of blood-red liquid. "Karkade." The servant poured her a cup of the cold hibiscus tea, and she took a long sip, savoring its sweetened tang before tearing off a strip of the buttery pastry and popping it in her mouth. It tasted exactly like she remembered, like home. "This is my home now," she reminded herself. Nahri took another bite of fatir. "Try some," she urged. "It's delicious." He helped himself while she sipped her karkade. Though she was enjoying the snack, there was something about the combination that was troubling her. And then it hit her. This was the same meal she'd eaten in the coffee house before she entered the cemetery in Cairo, before her life was abruptly upended, before she met Dara. Her appetite vanished, and her heart gave its usual lurch, whether from worry or longing she didn't know, and had given up trying to sort out. Dara had been gone for 2 months, longer than their original journey together, and yet she woke every morning still half expecting to see him. She missed him. His sly grin, his unexpected sweetness, even his constant grumbling, not to mention the occasional accidental press of his body against hers. Nahri pushed the food away, but the call to sunset prayer sounded out before Alizaide noticed. "Is it Maghrib already?" she asked as she wiped the sugar off her fingers. The time always seemed to fly when she was with the prince. "Nasreen is going to kill me. I told her I'd be back hours ago." Her assistant, although she occasionally felt more like a disapproving schoolmistress or scolding aunt to Nahri, had made her distaste for both Prince Alizaide and these tutoring sessions quite clear. Ali waited until the call to prayer was complete to respond. "Do you have a patient?" No one knew, but Nasreen wanted... She paused as Ali reached for one of his books, the sleeve of his pale robe falling back to reveal a badly swollen wrist. "What happened to you?" "It's nothing." He pulled his sleeve down. "Just a training accident from the other day." Nahri frowned. The djinn recovered quickly from non-magical injuries. It must have been a hard blow to still look like that. "Would you like me to heal you? It looks painful." He shook his head as he stood, although she noticed now that he was carrying his supplies with his left arm. "It's not that bad," he said, averting his eyes as she readjusted her chador. And it was well earned. I made a stupid mistake." He scowled. "Several, actually." She shrugged, accustomed by now to the prince's stubbornness. "If you insist." Ali placed the lock in a velvet box and handed it back to the attendant. "A lock," he mused again. "Daevabad's most esteemed scholars have themselves convinced this thing can calculate the number of stars in the sky. Couldn't they simply have asked another Shafit from the human world?" He hesitated. "That is not quite how things are done here." "It should be," she replied as they left the library. "It seems a waste of time otherwise." "I could not agree more." There was an oddly fierce edge to his voice, and Nahri wondered whether or not to press him further. He'd answer, she knew. He answered all her questions. By God, sometimes he talked so much it could be difficult to get him to stop. Nahri normally didn't mind. The taciturn young prince she'd first met had become her most enthusiastic source of information about the Jinn world, and strangely enough, she was beginning to enjoy their afternoons together, the one bright spot in her monotonous, frustrating days. But she also knew the issue of the Shafit was one which divided their tribes, the one which had led to the bloody overthrow of her ancestors at the hands of his. She held her tongue, and they kept walking. The white marble corridor shone with the saffron-hued light of sunset, and she could hear a few latecomers still singing the call to prayer from the city's distant minarets. She tried to slow her steps, enjoying another few moments of peace. Returning to the infirmary each day to inevitably fail at something new was like donning weighted sackcloth. Ali spoke again. "I don't know if you would be interested, but the traders who recovered that lock also found some sort of lens for observing the stars. Our scholars are attempting to restore it before the arrival of a comet in a few weeks." "You're sure it's not just a pair of spectacles?" she teased. He laughed. "God forbid. They'd die of disappointment. But if you like, I can arrange a viewing." Ali hesitated as a servant reached for the infirmary doors. "Perhaps my brother Muntadir can join us. His expedition is due back by then, and—" Nahri had stopped listening. A familiar voice caught her attention as the infirmary door opened, and she rushed in, praying her ears weren't deceiving her. They weren't. Sitting at one of her work tables, looking as harassed and handsome as always, was Dara. Her breath caught in her throat. Dara was bent low in conversation with Nasreen, but he abruptly straightened up when he caught sight of Nahri. His bright eyes met hers, filled with the same swirl of emotions she suspected was on her face. Her heart felt ready to leap out of her chest. "By the Most High, get hold of yourself." Nahri shut her mouth, realizing it was hanging open as Ali entered the room behind her. Nasreen shot to her feet, pressing her palms together. She bowed. "My prince." Dara stayed seated. "Little Zaidi, salam alaikum," he greeted in atrociously accented Arabic. He grinned. "How is your wrist?" Ali drew up, looking indignant. "You should not be here, Afshin. The Banu Nahida's time is precious. Only those who are ill or injured." Dara abruptly raised a fist and then smashed it through the heavy, sandblasted glass table. The top shattered, sparkling shards of hazy glass cascading over the Afshin and the floor. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he raised his hand and looked at the jagged pieces of glass embedded in his skin with mock surprise. "There," he deadpanned. "I'm injured." Ali stepped forward with an angry expression, and Nahri sprang into action. Dara's lunatic act snapping her into focus. Likely breaking at least a dozen rules of protocol, she grabbed the prince by the shoulders and spun him around toward the door. "I think Nasreen and I can handle this," she said with forced cheer as she pushed him out. "You wouldn't want to miss prayer." The astonished Jinn was opening his mouth to protest when she smiled and shut the door in his face. She took a deep breath to steady herself before turning back. "Leave us, Nasreen." "Banu Nahida, that is not appropriate." Nahri didn't even look at the other woman, her gaze directed at Dara alone. "Go!" Nasreen sighed, but before she could leave, Dara reached out to touch her wrist. "Thank you," he said with such sincerity that Nasreen blushed. "My heart is greatly lightened by knowing someone like you serves my Banu Nahida." "It is my honor," Nasreen replied, sounding uncharacteristically flustered. Nahri couldn't blame her. She'd felt that way often enough in Dara's presence. But she definitely was not feeling that way right now. She knew Dara could sense it. The moment Nasreen left, some of the bravado vanished from his face. He gave her a weak smile. "You've taken very quickly to ordering people around." Nahri picked her way through the remains of her destroyed table. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she demanded as she reached for his hand. He stepped back. "I might ask you the same. Ali Zaid al-Qahtani? Really, Nahri? Could you not find an Ifrit to befriend?" "He's not my friend, you fool," she said, grabbing again for his hand. "He's a mark, one I was having luck with until you sauntered into the palace and broke his wrist. Stop wiggling away." Dara held his arm above her head. "Did I really break it?" he asked with an impish grin. "I thought so." His bones made the most pleasant sound. He broke away from his reverie to glance down at her. "Does he know he's a mark?" Nahri thought back to Ali's comment on her lockpicking. "Probably," she admitted. He's not as much of a fool as I hoped." She didn't dare mention the fact that their friendship had started when she learned Ali was reading up on Dara. That was not news she expected to be well received. "You do know he's doing the same, yes?" There was a flicker of apprehension in Dara's face. "You can't trust him. I bet every other word out of his mouth is a lie meant to turn you toward their side." "Are you suggesting my ancestral enemy has an ulterior motive? But I've spilled all my deepest secrets. What will I do?" Nahri touched her heart in mock horror and then narrowed her eyes. "Have you forgotten who I am, Dara? I can handle Ali just fine." "Ali?" He scowled. "You've nicknamed the sandfly?" "I call you by a nickname." She could not have replicated Dara's reaction if she tried. His face twisted into a stormy mix of indignant hurt and pure outrage. "Wait!" Nahri felt herself starting to grin. "Are you jealous?" When his cheeks flushed, she laughed and clapped her hands together in delight. "By the Most High, you are!" She took in his beautiful eyes and muscular frame, awed as usual by his presence. "How does that even work for you? Have you looked in a mirror this century?" "I'm not jealous of the brat," Dara snapped. He rubbed his brow, and Nahri winced at the sight of the glass sticking out of his hand. "He's not the one they want you to marry," Dara added. "Excuse me?" Her humor vanished. "Did your new best friend not tell you? They want you to marry Emir Muntadir." Dara's eyes flashed. "A thing which will not be happening." "Muntadir?" Nahri remembered very little about Ali's older brother, except thinking that he looked like the type of man she'd easily fleece. "Where did you hear such an absurd rumor?" "From Ali's own mouth," he replied, exaggerating the nickname. "Why do you think I broke his wrist?" Dara let out an annoyed huff and crossed his arms over his chest. He was dressed like a proper Deva nobleman now, in a fitted dark gray coat that ended at his knees, wide embroidered belt, and baggy black pants. He cut a dashing figure, and as he shifted again, she caught a waft of the smoky cedar smell that always seemed to cling to his skin. A low heat sparked in her chest, even as he pressed his mouth in an irritated line. She remembered all too well the sensation of that mouth against hers, and it was making her mind spin in reckless directions. "What? Nothing to say?" he challenged. "No thoughts on your impending nuptials?" She had plenty of thoughts, just not about Muntadir. "You seem to object," she said mildly. "Of course I object. They have no right to interfere in your bloodline. Your heritage is already suspect. You should be marrying the most high-caste Deva nobleman they can find." She gave him an even look. Like you? No, he said, flustered. I didn't say that. It has nothing to do with me. She crossed her arms. Perhaps if you felt so concerned about my future in Daevabad, you might have stayed in Daevabad instead of running after Ifrit. She threw up her hands. So? What happened? You didn't ride in triumphantly with their heads in a bloody bag, so I'm guessing you didn't have much luck. Dara's shoulders dropped. Whether due to disappointing her or losing out on the chance to participate in the above scenario, she wasn't sure. I'm sorry, Nahri. The anger had vanished from his voice. They were long gone. A tiny hope Nahri hadn't quite known she had been nursing snuffed out in her chest. But considering how dejected Dara sounded, she masked her own reaction. It's all right, Dara. She reached for his good hand. Come here. She plucked a long pair of tweezers from the work table that was still standing, and then pulled him toward a pile of floor cushions. Sit. We can talk while I remove the pieces of furniture stuck in your hand. They sank into the cushions, and he obediently held out his palm. It didn't look as bad as she feared. There were only about a half-dozen fragments in his skin, and all were fairly large. There was no blood, a fact she didn't want to dwell on. Dara's hot skin was real enough for her. She pulled free one of the shards and dropped it into a tin pan at her side. So we know nothing more? Nothing, he replied, his voice bitter. And I have no idea where to turn next. Her mind went to Ali's books and to the millions crowding the library. There might be answers there, but Nahri couldn't even imagine where to start without help, and it seemed too risky to involve anyone else, even someone like Nasreen, who would probably be willing to help. He looked crushed, far more than she would have expected. It's all right, Dara, really, she insisted. Whatever happened in the past is just that, past. A dark look crossed his face. It's not, he muttered. Not at all. An aggrieved squawk suddenly sounded from behind the drawn curtain on the opposite side of the room. Dara jumped. Don't worry, Nahri sighed. It's a patient. Dara looked incredulous. Are you treating birds? By next week I might be. Some Agni-Vanchi scholar opened the wrong scroll and now he has a beak. Every time I try to help, he sprouts more feathers. Dara drew up an alarm, casting a glance behind him, and she quickly held up a hand. He can't hear us. He blew out his eardrums, and briefly mine, with all his carrying on. Nahri dropped another shard in the pan. As you see, I have enough to occupy my mind here without fretting over my origins. He shook his head, but settled back down. "And how is that?" he asked, his voice gentler. "How are you doing here?" Nahri started to toss off a flippant answer and then stopped. This was Dara, after all. "I don't know," she confessed. "You know the life I lived before. In many ways, this place is like a dream. The clothes, the jewels, the food. It's like paradise." He smiled. "I had a feeling you'd take a liking to royal luxury." "But I feel as though it's an illusion, like I'm one mistake from having it all stripped away. And, Dara, I'm making so many of them," she confessed. "I'm a terrible healer. I'm outmatched when it comes to all these political games, and I'm just so—" She took a deep breath, aware she was rambling. "I'm tired, Dara. My mind is being pulled in 1,000 directions, and my training, by God, Nasreen is trying to condense what seems like 20 years of study into 2 months. You're not a terrible healer." He gave her a reassuring smile. "You're not. You healed me after the Rook attack, didn't you? You just need to focus. Scattered minds are the enemy of magic. And give yourself time. You're in Daevabad now. Start thinking in terms of decades and centuries instead of months and years. Don't worry yourself over these political games. Playing them is not your place. There are those of our tribe far more qualified to do so on your behalf. Focus on your training." "I suppose." The answer was typical of Dara, practical advice with a side of condescension. She changed the subject. "I didn't even know you were back. I take it you're not staying at the palace?" Dara snorted. "I would sleep on the street before sharing a roof with these people. I'm staying with the Grand Wazir. He was a companion of your mother's. She and her brother spent much of their childhood on his family's estates in Zariaspa." Nahri wasn't sure what to make of that. There was an eagerness about Kaveh-i Pramukh that unsettled her. When she first arrived, he was constantly dropping by the infirmary, bringing gifts and staying for hours to watch her work. She finally asked Nasreen to discreetly intervene, and she hadn't seen much of him since. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Dara. I don't trust him." "Is that because your sandfly prince told you not to?" Dara eyed her. "Because let me tell you, Kaveh has a great deal to say on the subject of Alizade al-Khatani." "None of it good, I suppose." "Not in the slightest." Dara lowered his voice. "You need to be careful, little thief," he warned. "Palaces are dangerous places for second sons, and that one strikes me as a hothead. I don't want you caught up in any political feuds if Alizade al-Khatani ends up with a silk cord around his neck." That image bothered her more than she cared to admit. He's not my friend, she reminded herself. He's a mark. I can take care of myself. But you don't need to, Dara replied, sounding annoyed. Nahri, did you not hear what I just said? Let others play politics. Stay away from these princes. They are beneath you anyway. Says the one whose political knowledge is a millennium outdated. Fine, she lied. She had no intention of turning away her best source of information, but she didn't feel like fighting. She dropped a final shard in the pan. That's the last of the glass. He offered a wry smile. I'll find a less destructive way to see you next time. He tried to pull his hand away. She held firm. It was his left hand, the same hand marked by what she now knew was a record of his time as a slave. The tiny black rungs spiraled out from his palm like a snail, twisting around his wrist and vanishing underneath his sleeve. She rubbed her thumb against the one at the base of his hand. Dara's face darkened. I take it your new friend told you what they mean? Nahri nodded, keeping her expression neutral. How many? How far do they go? For once he gave up an answer without fighting. Up my arm and all over my back. I stopped counting after about 800. She squeezed his hand and then let go. There's so much you didn't tell me, Dara, she said softly. About slavery, about the war. She met his gaze. About leading a rebellion against Zaidi al-Qahtani. I know. He dropped his gaze, twisting his ring. But I spoke truthfully to the king. Well, about slavery, anyway. Save what you and I saw together, I remember nothing of my time as a slave. Dara cleared his throat. What we saw was enough for me. She had to agree. To her, it seemed a mercy that Dara couldn't remember his time in captivity, but it didn't answer the rest. And the war, Dara? The rebellion? He looked up, apprehension in his bright eyes. Did the brat tell you anything? No. Nahri had been avoiding the darker rumors of Dara's past. I'd like to hear it from you. He nodded. All right, he said, soft resignation in his voice. Kaveh is trying to arrange a reception for you at the Grand Temple. Ghassan is being resistant. His tone made it clear he didn't think much of the king's opinion. But it would be a good place to talk without interruption. The rebellion, what happened before the war, it's a long story. Dara swallowed, visibly nervous. You'll have questions, and I want to have time to explain. to make you understand why I did the things I did." The Birdman let out another screech, and Dara made a face. "But not today. You should check on him before he flies away, and I need to go. Nasreen is right about us being alone together. The sandfly knows you are here with me, and I would not wish to harm your reputation." "Don't worry about my reputation," she said lightly. "I do enough damage on my own." A wry smile played at the corner of his lips, but he said nothing, simply staring at her as if he was drinking her in. In the infirmary's soft light, Nahri found it difficult not to do the same, to not memorize the way the sunlight played in his wavy black hair, the jewel-like gleam in his emerald eyes. "You look beautiful in our clothes," he said softly, running a finger lightly along the embroidered hem of her sleeve. "It's hard to believe you're the same ragged girl I pulled from a ghoul's jaws, the one who left a trail of stolen belongings from Cairo to Constantinople." He shook his head. "And to learn you're actually the daughter of one of our greatest healers." A note of reverence crept into his voice. "I should be burning cedar oil in your honor." "I'm sure enough has already been wasted over me." He smiled, but the expression didn't meet his eyes. He dropped his hand from hers, something like regret seeming to pass across his face. "Nahri, there is something we should—" He suddenly frowned, his head snapping up as if he'd heard a suspicious noise. He glanced at the door, appearing to listen for another second. Anger swept the confusion off his face. He abruptly rose to his feet, marching to the door and all but ripping it off its hinges. Alizaid al-Khatani stood on the other side. The prince didn't look even the slightest bit ashamed to have been caught. Indeed, as Nahri watched, he tapped his foot against the floor and crossed his arms, his steely eyes focused on Dara alone. "I thought you might need help finding your way out." Smoke curled around Dara's collar. He cracked his knuckles, and Nahri tensed. But he went no further. Instead, still glaring at Ali, Dara directed his words to her, continuing to speak in the Vasti that Nahri was immediately relieved the prince couldn't understand. "I can't talk to you with this half-tribe brat lurking around." He all but spat the words in Ali's face. "Stay safe." He poked Ali hard in the chest to move him out of the doorway, and left. Nahri's heart sank at the sight of his retreating back. She threw Ali an annoyed look. "Are we spying on each other so openly now?" For a moment she expected the mask of friendship to drop, to see Ghassan reflected in Ali's face, to get a hint of whatever was really driving him to meet with her every day. Instead, she saw what looked like a war of loyalties play across his face before he dropped his gaze. He opened his mouth, then paused as if considering his words. "Please be careful," he said softly. Nahri, you don't... He abruptly shut his mouth and stepped back. I'm sorry," he stammered. "Have a good night."